Hello, welcome to the How To Academy, and I'm Robin Ince. I'm not going to do a huge introduction to who we're going to be talking to this evening because you've already looked at the blurb, and afterwards you can look it up anyway. They are authors of this. I'm going to show you the proof copy. This is not the cover, it actually has two heads, which is a fantastic comic book exploring many of the ideas about the mind from the brain and metacognition and a lot more, but using comic book format. And it's fantastic. And we're joined by Uta and Chris Frith. Uta was on an episode of the Infinite Monkey Cage show that I do about the brain, and we didn't actually manage to get to question one. As anyone who regularly watches any of our discussions we have about the human brain, we find out that one of the things about the human brain is it is easily diverted into many tangents. And we're going to try and get to question three. Chris, I should say, his book Making Up Your Mind, which I actually freed from Brian Cox's office, was a hugely influential book on a show that I wrote about the mind. And so we have two people who their knowledge and their experience over the last, in fact, over 40 years in terms of investigating the human brain has led to many revelations. So Uta and Chris, good evening.
Hi.
Hi, Brian.
I want to start off with this because I love this book and I love the comic book format. It's one of my favorite ways of kind of exploring ideas, and I think it's very kind of it's not threatening in any way, and it allows people to dive in. But what were the limitations and what were the advantages in terms of exploring sometimes these very intricate ideas in the comic book format?
Well, I think we were quite clear that we were taking a big risk there. It seemed to us an adventure, but we felt really quite happy about trying something new, mainly because, you know, we have all this backlog, this track record of, you know, very ordinary, sometimes boring scientific papers. And, you know, we know how to do that. But this seemed an interesting idea in view of, I think, a sort of strong passion for science communication. We do like people to talk about our work, but first they have to know about it. And I suppose it's a lot of chance elements. We like comic books, and we were totally inspired by one in particular, which is called Logic Comics. It is absolutely brilliant. I mean, it just sort of suddenly defined a new way of talking, in this case, about logic and philosophy.
Including Gödel's proof, which is very difficult to understand in any format.
So one of the advantages, of course, for us is that in image form, you can really present experiments. You can even put a kind of picture of the experimenter in there. You might even present a graph, all very succinctly. But of course, there are limitations. Of course, it's not the same as having all the details of the method, all the details about the numbers of participants and all that sort of thing, which you normally have to put into a paper. So there is a danger.
But on the other hand, it's probably one of the first comic books that has a reference section at the end and an index.
So we try and say there is evidence whenever we can. And even we made a point of talking about what is good science, you know, how to do it well, how to recognize it, and be skeptical.
Yes, and how to recognize bad science or bad brain imaging. Yeah.
Well, that's it. We were talking about this just before we went on air. You know, what are the ideas that you find most infuriating when they're regurgitated, say in the popular press or the mass media? Because I know every neuroscientist, psychologist I know will go, "Oh, they brought that one out again." So Chris, is there any particular bugbear?
Well, I guess the one that keeps coming back and back is the left brain, right brain story. And I mean, it's fine in terms of the psychology, which they ascribe, which they talk about, but it doesn't in any way relate to the left brain and the right brain. So that, I mean, that's the difference there. I mean, the other one that is more subtle, which we're very interested in, is the idea that you have the unconscious processes and you have conscious processes. And the unconscious processes are generally thought to be, you know, the animality of us. They're the selfish part of us. And the conscious processes are what we need to overcome this selfish part of us. This really goes right back to the Enlightenment, if not earlier. But in fact, if anything, it's the other way around. The unconscious processes are actually very altruistic, at least in relation to our people who are in our in-group. And it's the conscious processes that we can use to promote all sorts of evil ideas and practices. So I think that's another distinction that I think needs to be overcome.
Yeah.
Uta, is there anything else for you?
Infuriating things like, you know, this idea that we only use 10% of our brain seems to be sort of still around, that, you know, as if we could fill it up and do much more than we're actually doing. In fact, you know, most of the brain is there, as far as we know, to keep us, you know, upright and let us breathe and just, you know, survive from moment to moment. It's incredibly busy, incredibly energy intensive, and it always looks, of course, we think, for the least effort, you know, best trade-off that can be done in when we have to put in some effort, some attention, naturally.
Yes,
it's a lovely idea. The idea that something would evolve in biology where 90% of it just did absolutely nothing. After all of that, there's something so complex with all of that. I think the old line used to be, you know, that it's not true that we only use 10% of our brain, but recent research has said that people who say we only use 10% of their brain do only use 10% of their brain.
Right.
I wonder, you start off talking about, and again, this so much of your work over the period of the time that you've been working in psychology and neuroscience and metacognition, so much of it seems to have developed, in my mind, quite rapidly in terms of a huge change. It does feel like this is very much a mid to late 20th century and beyond area of science, that much that came before it, and some of it in that period, is now seen as null and void. Chris, how do you feel about that?
I mean, the biggest change for us, I guess, was the invention of brain imaging. And and indeed the whole idea that psychology is actually about how the brain works. And this happened at roughly the same time. But I mean, so there was something called neuropsychology, where people looked at what happened to people's experience and behavior after brain lesions. And that showed that you had to take that, and that was very important to developing psychological theory. So, I mean, there was a famous case of HM who had his hippocampuses removed on both sides and then completely lost his memory, apparently. And what earlier on appeared from that, and it wasn't just him, there are other patients that I've seen also, is that it wasn't that his memory had completely gone. There's all sorts of aspects of learning and memory which are completely intact. So that what happened with the patient I saw, I taught him a new motor skill. And he came every day and practiced this skill. And by the end of the week, he was incredibly good at it. But he couldn't remember having ever met me before or having actually done this skill before. So he was completely amazed that he could do it. So there you had a dramatic distinction between a motor skill learning, which remained intact and is presumably done by a different bit of the brain than remembering what happened yesterday.
See, that's what I find. I mean, I find that, I think with it was HM, there was the games like Tetris, for instance, were used later on, weren't they? And this idea that every time he would sit down and say, "I've never played this before," and every time he would be better, because and that is, I think, initially when you find out about those ideas, very disconcerting to find out how much of the activity of our mind is unconscious. And I don't know if you've ever, you know, sometimes there is that point where you think, am I merely a post hoc rationalizing machine, that everything that's going to happen happens? I am here going, no, I'm in charge. It's like a ridiculous dandy fop, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, Uta, do you find that, you know, when you first started to discover these ideas and actually see the experiments that worked, it does seem to be, you know, I'm not in control at all. I'm like a child at the front of the bus with one of those things that's just stuck on and has a little horn.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is this sort of, you know, you suddenly sort of think, oh my God, the rug is pulled from under my feet. I'm just a little sort of plaything of all sorts of events and things that might be happening. But remember, we love feeling in control, don't we? And I would say we are actually well equipped to be in control in many ways. We can overcome you know, certain impulses and things that are not really good for us. And one of the things that I think we believe may have evolved over, you know, millions and millions of years, different organisms, different creatures, different species, is an ability maybe to put yourself out of the absolute here and now of the sort of context, just, you know, the next millisecond or second of survival, and have a longer term view. And I think as human beings, that's one of the things we actually can do. And by the way, it develops. It's not really very well worked out in children. And it really takes quite a long time, but we can do it. We can actually exert control. And furthermore, it's very easy for us to use other people to help us exerting this control. In fact, we use instructions from others. It helps if somebody says, now, we can actually get into gear much more easily. And one other thing, which we're very interested in, is that just having rules evolved again through, you know, culture, free us from having to immediately think, oh my God, you know, I'm lost here. I don't know what to do. For example, the simple rule that you drive on the left side or on the right, whatever it may be, so you won't collide. It seems such an amazing solution. And we can incorporate that in our brains. There are all sorts of rules like that, many of them quite unspoken, but you know, when they're broken. And some of the rules have, you know, punishment if they're broken, but other rules, interestingly, may not be, you know, you think, well, most people would do certain things in a particular cultural context. And yet it doesn't matter that much. Perhaps you have this sort of tolerance that there can be some exceptions. So that again avoids sort of total friction and collision, which is absolutely important when we are living, you know, with other people around us.
It seems that it is quite important to try and step out of your mind, to look at your mind. But then, of course, you go, this is the thing that before we get onto PET scans and fMRI, I just thought about your thoughts of the fact that we're in this odd situation where, and I use the word machine with big inverted commas around it, but we're trying to investigate the machine with the machine itself, which seems you find yourself then in a loop where you go, even when I step outside, I'm using the machine itself, I'm carrying that with me. How do you feel about those problems? And that's, I mean, that's both a philosophical as well as kind of a technological problem.
Well, yes, this is, I mean, we do talk about this. This is, I mean, you sometimes can call this recursion. So that, and, but we, I mean, in a sense, that's what psychology or neuroscience is about. So, for example, in the last few years, there's been enormous developments in understanding how decision-making works. And we have a model of how, there are various models of how decision-making works. But the fact that we have a model of how decision-making works is this is already a model of our brain, invented by our brain. And we don't really have any trouble of thinking, yes, we can understand how decision-making works. And then the metacognition comes in, where you not only do you have a model of how the world is, you have a model of how I work, and then I can say, is this a good model or not? Should I improve it? And this is particularly, as Uta was saying, this is where discussion with other people is extraordinarily valuable. And I think in that part of, I think what is saying, what I'm saying is that even though one brain on its own might not be able to deal with this problem, because we have lots of brains all working together, I think that's how we solve that. To some extent, we solve this problem of recursion. But recursion is, I mean, it's a feature of human language, and it's also a feature of television sitcoms and all sorts of things like this, where you're constantly saying, does he know that she knows that he knows?
And it doesn't seem too much of an effort, actually, when you think how much we enjoy reading, say, spy novels, where it's always sort of about, you know, the minds of other people, what they want to hide, what some revelation might tell you about even a third person. And we can navigate in that space remarkably well. Not too well, I should say. There is a severe limit as to how many steps we can.
2.5.
2.5 steps above saying, yeah, he thinks that, rather than he thinks that I think that, you know, somebody else thinks.
Well, that to me is a very interesting part where trying to come up with the average brain, because again, it seems like, you know, I mean, I find social media quite an interesting kind of lab to look at. The incredibly different interpretations that can be made over 280 characters, and then the arguments around it, and then the different levels of empathy. And we see this a lot in kind of the way that politics is talked about. And we saw it a lot during things like COVID, where some people would say, well, what do you care? It's not going to affect you, which seemed to be a huge leap of different empathy to a lot of other people. So that seemed to, I remember talking to a neuroscientist who said when he was very young and studying, starting to think about things like levels of consciousness, that we look at it between different species, but the idea that there might be 5 people in a room and they actually experience different levels of consciousness. I mean, that's a very difficult thing to investigate as well, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, yes, I mean, that's, what would I say? I mean, I'm very interested that there must be at least 2 levels of consciousness, one of which one might call sentience, which is just being aware. And the next level up is where you're aware that you're aware.
And even more important, aware that you're not aware of certain things.
Yes, that's what Steve Fleming talks about. The most difficult thing is to know that you haven't seen the target. Sort of thing. Yeah. But there's an experiment, a quite nice experiment, that's purported to demonstrate this, where you're given a very boring book to read about how the brain works or something like that, or how to use fMRI. And after a few minutes, you realize that although your eyes are still moving across the page, you're actually thinking about what you're going to have for supper tonight. And at that point, you're suddenly jumping up a step because you realize that the contents of your consciousness is not what it ought to be.
Mm.
So that's jumping up to this next level. But most of the time we can operate at the lower level, I think, and we occasionally get these shocks where we realize that we're not thinking about what we're supposed to be thinking about.
See, I find it, I'm tremendously, I'm quite kind of, I think, hyper vigilant in terms of I don't switch off very much. That's, I think, one of the many reasons I can't do sport. I don't very rarely go into any flow state. I have my, in fact, when I once briefly had therapy, the therapist after 3 weeks just said, it just sounds very tiring being you. And then other people seem to be able to switch off very easily. But if I'm not, if I'm on a train and I have disappeared for a moment, when I come back, my first thought is, what have I been doing? What's happened? It's only been a split second. I don't like going away, but other people seem to be able to just, you know, far more relaxed and calm people.
Oh, phew.
But yes, that's right. I mean, there's certainly lots of suggestions that, particularly in sport, if you think about it, that's where it all goes wrong. And that's how if you play golf, which of course I never actually do, apparently the thing to do is to make the person think about their stroke, and then they will really...
You mess them up completely. Yes, you can't do that. Like the famous, you know, millipede saying.
But that's, I mean, that raises the question that I think you were hinting at before. Given all these things that consciousness is bad for, what is it actually good for? And I guess one of the things that we, as I say, it's this metaconscious level where once we are able to think about what we're thinking about and to think about what we're experiencing, we're for the first time, perhaps in evolution, able to talk to other people about what we're thinking about and what we're experiencing. We can actually share our experiences. And that, I think, makes a big difference.